Hi, everybody. Steve Cady here with All Things Change, our webinar podcast series. I'm at Bowling Green State University with our Doctorate in Organizational Development and Change program as well. And we have some of my good friends here today, which is really nice. And we had a session with Gil several weeks ago. It was really impactful. Lots of people mentioned that they enjoyed it. They want to re-listen to it or share it with other people. It was very informative, Gil. I liked it because I think the grounding in history, particularly some of the very practical, evidence-based perspectives. I mean, for example, when you were sharing some of the early research studies with the farmers and the two different groups and some of Lewin's early work, and then going on through with all the different processes. So I always thought it would be great just to have a follow-up and just really kind of a post-show reflection on that and my learnings, but also just to kind of dive into some different topics and see where we might go.
Cool. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So from that talk, what was in the talk that you did, what was probably, if you had the most important point for you that you would want people to remember from what you shared in that last talk, or just in general maybe, but is there one thing that was really important to you that you want to make sure people remember?
Well, I believe that he succeeded at creating a social science frame that really helps clarify individual, group, national, global dynamics, and then some simple ways to influence change. Part of his belief was that everyone's trying to influence in their families, in their work lives, and in their political lives, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with trying to influence. And so, how do you actually influence things like beliefs? He was a student of educational processes, just like Dewey. I'm actually reading Dewey right now, Experience in Education. I've been influenced by his ideas, but I've never read the book. And so that's like a few years ago, I realized even though I was doing Lewinian OD, I had hardly read Lewin. And that's when I really started diving in and realizing how much there was. But so I just think it's practical. Like his autobiographer said, he was the practical theorist. I just spent 2 days with a group and I let them influence the agenda for the 2 days. And they got what they wanted out of the 2 days. And I think it's in no small part because I just let them, I gave them some structure, but they went after what they wanted to go after. And that's very Lewinian, is to let the people that you're assisting figure out what they're trying to, what they're doing, and come up with their own, at least influence as much as possible.
All right,
So,
that's cool. And in that event that you designed and helped invited them into create with you, what were your boundaries that you set for them?
well, I don't try to create psychological safety, for instance. Like I don't necessarily set rules at the start of something. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. So I'm not sure I would say that I really set boundaries. I had already worked with their boss. So this was uh, a vice president of manufacturing and the 6 people that report to him. And we had already talked about the design. And then he talked about what he was hoping to get out of the 2 days. And so then I talked about that I was going to approach it with training, a little bit of training. And then mostly, though, they were going to talk about the topics that they want to talk about, in particular topics that may seem very touchy to them, that they maybe even avoid with each other. And so we spent some time creating a list of taboo topics, or at least touchy topics.
Hmm.
And then they talked about those topics while they worked on self-awareness and interpersonal skills. And so, I mean, I just sort of tell them, here's transparent as possible. Here's what I'm doing. Here's why I'm doing it. Lewin said training, action, research. I've already exposed these people to Lewin. And and then there's a fair amount of trust already with this particular group. So they trust their boss, they trust me, and they went ahead and went at it.
Wow. And anything come out of that experience that surprised them? What surprised them about it?
Well, they gave each other, they just had never had conversations like they had about these topics that were difficult. So uh they were just, I don't know if they didn't say I'm surprised at the end. They just said they were sort of like really uh thankful that they dug into that stuff and sort of got some the elephant in the room was no longer in between them. Because that is one way I framed, talking about touchy topics. If you don't, at least my theory is that they're going to get in between you. Whatever you're avoiding is going to get in between you and cause complications that go beyond just avoiding that topic. That's
Gotcha.
my
How do you
feeling.
Can you talk a little bit about if you were talking to somebody trying to figure out how to do that for the first time? What would be ways in which a person can bring that topic up? But what are some of the practical ways to bring the topic up, introduce it, or get them to begin to talk about it? What are the ways that you find that you like to do that?
Well, when I was just a lad, I started working with my father when I was 24, and he, at the time, was using surveys a lot. Had actually created the first computer survey where of organizations, people performance profile, it was called. And so everybody in the whole organization would fill it out. And then it would go back to each work team, their data. And Dad, when he was designing this with his colleague John Scherer, he was also getting advice from Ron Lippitt, and had been getting advice from Ron Lippitt since 1950, the mid 1950s. And Lippitt, of course, was very tight with Lewin, and Lippitt said to Dad in a private conversation that the primary law should be something like whoever filled the thing out should be able to look at their own data. And that's violated in the way that many people use surveys. They use it like an expert. The organization fills it out, then the expert gets it, looks at it, and says, there seems to be mistrust here. Have more cookouts or something. But they're guessing. If anytime you look at someone else's data, even if you've worked with stuff all your life, like I have, I'm still just guessing. What do they mean by this mark here? Well, only the person that filled it out knows for sure what they meant.
Right.
So Dad's design, which was simple enough for a 24-year-old to follow, in two tomato processing plants, I worked with every intact group in those plants, which means the top person with their direct reports, those people with all their direct reports, those people with all their direct reports, so that every boss and subordinate combination on the org chart had their own meeting. And they, and even if it was a small group like four, they'd still look at their own data. And they had help, of course, which is important. And the person in charge was very clear. Look, I want you to figure out how to make this place better with this data. If I hear that individual supervisors are taking this and just getting mad at their employees and wondering why anyone gave them a low rating and making a fuss or any kind of retribution, then I'm going to deal with that. In their own way, people have to say something like that, but it just doesn't happen all that much in my experience. So anyway, so then I was in there with, especially what I remember is the frontline supervisors and their crew, and the crew mostly was not even high school educated. And the frontline supervisor may or may not have been. I remember in one crew that the frontline supervisor had once upon a time taken a can of tomato paste and thrown it at one of the employees. And so they were still upset about that. It was years ago, but they just were people trying to do work. And every one of those groups could look at their data and say, you know what? Uh, we need this from this group on time. And when maintenance works on our equipment, uh, actually we could be staying, one of us, and explaining to them what we noticed before the equipment broke. And for, always in manufacturing plants, the people actually doing the work are going, why doesn't maintenance have spare parts when they need them? So they do action research. So this, anybody could do this. You can take, I just have a survey now I use sometimes. It's only 10 questions. Like, are we getting what we need from other groups? Are we giving what we need to give to other groups? Okay, 1 to 10, rate it. And even if you rate it high, okay, so what can you do to sustain it? But then you just talk about each question. And so it's a force field analysis. What's not working, what's working, what can we do about it? And then hourly workers will say, okay, so from now on, we'll do this. One of my favorite experiences was a 3-day planning process, actually. So it was a little different than that. But the hourly workers said, our parts are always delivered out to this platform in our area where they get rained on. And this is in a bauxite refinery. So they get covered with our own industrial sludge. And only in a few days, they're pretty much worthless. And so I would like to build a shelter. And so then the organization has to be organized to support if the hourly workers come up with an action and the boss says do it, which usually they're going to do, because by the time you're done with the conversation, you're just going to have stuff that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, you have to say, no, we're not going to do it. And you have to talk about it. But if you're uh, if you say yes to the hourly worker and then they're the one that's leading the action, then you got to make sure the supervisor is giving them time. You have to monitor anything in an organization. Most bosses hate that monitoring activity. It's just, and so and a lot of OD people don't like it. They want to eliminate hierarchy by having the whole organization just be flat, like that'll solve all the human issues and so on. Anyway, I'm sort of a cynic about that kind of thing. But so anyway, but then those guys built that shelter in a week. And so now from now on, they had clean parts. And so that just had all kinds of implications for productivity, but also for morale.
Right.
So anyone can do that. And I'll send them a survey if they want, free. It's got even instructions about how to use it. Anyone can do that. Who is monitoring for? Monitoring, the way I'm talking about it is, well, to know whether stuff gets done. So if you have commitments to action, then it is, I think, wise to have those be like public, like on somewhere where it's visible, and to have a conversation in a month where you say, okay, now how's this going? And if it's not going where it needs to go, then what's happening? And is there some way we can help you? Uh, but if you just say, okay, we're going to get all this stuff done by the fourth quarter, and there's no follow-up, there's no monitoring, there's no, then good, the odds are you'll get to the fourth quarter and everyone will go, oh, we were supposed to get all this stuff done. And I don't necessarily agree with is it Ryan? Is that how you say your
Yeah,
name?
that's how you say it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, yes, that is. I
no
can't be on
worries.
video, but audio, sure. Um,
But I don't necessarily think that, see, I think monitoring is transparency if you're doing it in a public, transparent way. And also, it's important to be talking about your intentions. But back to Dewey. Dewey said, look, experiential learning is absolutely what he wished the education system did, instead of just forcing people to memorize and obey. But that doesn't mean you just have no structure. Like any experience is good for learning. Not necessarily. It's not. And so you need structure, and that's Lewin too about leadership. You got to have the right amount of structure, or people are going to be confused. And if they're confused, they're going to be less productive, and they'll probably also be irritable. Morale will actually go down. Too much structure, that's a problem. But not enough structure is absolutely also a problem.
well, it's the tyranny of structurelessness, right? That there's if you're in a group again with no direction, but I think when there is accountability between individuals and an agreement on standards between individuals and a willingness to engage in consultative process about those standards and about that performance, that that monitoring can be with those agreements and standards done in a small group as opposed to having a person with authority hold that group accountable.
Sure, I agree, especially
I
like
mean, maybe that's a Pollyanna kind of thing, but I believe that's possible and should be.
yeah. Well, I think that's true of like my brother and I work together. We hold standards, and we don't need someone else above us to be watching or something. What we do, but and so in like a nuclear plant, there will often be a team of mechanics that are given freedom to sort of be available in the moment, and they're usually really experienced, and they need less supervision. And they understand the standards better. But if they were not responding to requests, and or the work was not sustaining, the repairs weren't sustaining like they should, or something, there's eventually other people in the system are going to say, well, wait a second, you guys you're not meeting the overall standard.
Right.
And so there's always authority in the system. Uh,
And yeah, again, I don't want to take it too far off, but I think what you're talking about again with in a nuclear power plant with master engineers in a small group performing to a standard where there are super high stakes and a lack of compliance with those standards causes disastrous harm, then I think that I mean what I'm hearing is that there's when I'm the authority, and you mentioned the word authority, I guess that if you have that small group, then each master in that case can hold the other person accountable to a level of mastery. And that's the mastery based authority as opposed to positional or arbitrary or assigned authority. So, I mean, there's a balance. Obviously, there's a balance between a structured business entity within a particular context, but the ideal, I mean, thinking you want to have people who are professionals, who are willing to have the social density in the group to challenge each other to achieve even more and to higher standards. So yeah, I mean
You know,
that's just what I'm hearing there.
I think the ideal is effectiveness. You know, it's performance. If that comes from sort of a self-organized team that that's great.
Yeah.
But if it comes from a boss subordinate relationship, that's also great. I don't think there's one is better than the other. I just
Yeah.
think what's important is it working?
Yeah.
One
I
of the
want
questions
to
go ahead, go ahead.
sorry, Steve. I'm
Go
just
ahead,
going to
Dave.
toss into the conversation some old history, but uh, in the 80s, I made sure I learned as much as I could about the quality movement, people like Joseph Turan and others, and the Japanese. And one term that they use, the Japanese use, that seemed to me to be the uh, way forward for any of us who are thinking about management and leadership was the word Gemba, Gemba,
Mhm.
which means the place of work. And the promise that the executives would make in the Japanese companies, like Toyota, was that they would be sure in their schedule, maybe not daily, but particularly every week, to go to the Gemba. Just go, be there, be present. Don't go with an agenda. Don't go with orders. Don't go with expecting people to bow down, which really I found quite astounding, given my thought of the Japanese being very imperial.
Well, they
It turned out
certainly
just the opposite. They
have
understood
structure.
it was a deep structure,
Yeah.
but it was based on the willingness of the top people to be humble and to be patient and to listen.
Mhm.
And when we contrasted that with the modeling of American manufacturing management in those days, with the surveys and so forth that were coming out, just the opposite.
Mhm.
They were, at least the upper level, were perceived as being arrogant and disinterested and more driven by external forces than they were to understand what was really making them the money. So it was kind of an interesting contrast. When we brought the quality systems together for things like Kaizen events, which basically put a mix of people with and so sort of suspended their positions equally so they could get the job done. It was wonderful to see what would emerge, like
Mhm.
the shelter over the product,
Mhm.
and it would emerge quickly and be done, which then dazzled the American manufacturing folks who would hear about these Kaizen events. They'd say, "This is impossible. It would have taken 18 months." No, it took 3 days. Why?
Mhm.
Because everyone agreed it had to get done in order for the Gemba to be a healthy and positive place for work to get done. So that word stuck with me for a long. It still does.
Yeah, and it's you know, everywhere I go, a lot of what I do is in the steel and aluminum industries, and they've certainly tried to adapt the Toyota production system. So,
Yes, they did.
uh, and I've seen it where it's the Kaizen is uh, selected, the focus is selected by an expert or by management, and the workers are just sort of there as
Yeah.
extras. And I've seen it where and they're actually doing stuff that doesn't make any sense to the workers. I mean, we're here to help you try to focus on something that we don't even think is the most important thing to focus on. And then I've seen it done where they have done a very nice job of letting the workers influence what to focus on, where they've really helped turn it into and then of course, if that happens, and then they're much more likely to sustain it because they're the ones that have to sustain it.
They
So
live in it every single day. Yeah.
yeah, so you can screw it up, or I think it's almost true of any approach to improving things. You can take almost any approach, like quality circles, and I mean, there's been some total productive maintenance, and then you can either do it by shoving it down people's throats, And you're going to get the likely result that it doesn't give you the results you were hoping for. And then you might blame it, whatever it is, must have been, wasn't the right thing. We need a new thing. And so anyway, that's, been going on since the dawn of time, probably, uh, but yeah, the whole idea of humility and yet being they still have to make decisions.
Sure.
And it's their decision. The workers are making decisions, the boss is making decisions, and but to have the humility to, at least as I was taught it, when the supervisor, when the hourly employee in Toyota stops the production line because they believe there's something that could affect quality, that the first response from the supervisor was that they were to come over and say thank you. And
Yep.
that's pretty outside the norm of what.
Yeah, it was even when that line's
Most
not
Americans.
moving, they're losing money. They're losing
Yeah.
a lot of money. So that
Right.
was one of the marvelous findings from the Toyota system. They were shocked. Oh, you mean you were willing to stop the flow of cars while
Right.
they got in there underneath the hood? And here we are in 2024 with Boeing now with that Max plane completely on the ropes.
Yeah.
And I thought, who could have stopped the line when they were doing all that assembly on those planes? And
A bunch of people were concerned.
logically said, hey, this makes no sense.
A lot of people were concerned, in retrospect, when they started to investigate. There were a lot of people concerned.
But they weren't listened to, were they?
Right,
And I think
right.
that's what we teach in our current students coming out, particularly in these organization development programs. And I want to go back to Lewin. If anything else, he modeled a listener, didn't he? I mean, what I've read about him, heard about his work, he listened keenly, unlike what I'm doing right now.
You're doing fine. See, he listened keenly, but he wasn't afraid to also tell people what he thinks.
Oh no! But
So
after they saw that he listened, then when he spoke, they said, "Oh, he's picking up on what we have said and not strictly coming in with an agenda and a speech," which is what really turns off. I've experienced about a dozen deans in my life in universities, and the 3 or 4 who had agendas and speeches and basically talked to faculty at faculty
like
could
the faculty
could cool down a whole school within a few weeks.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, and Lewin was quite clear that when working in industry and outside of industry too, that his first task was to create what he called we feeling, to connect with the people that were there, to let them know that he respects them, so there's step one for any young OD person. You don't have to have all the answers anyway. The people have the answers. So you're there to help provide some structure, at least the way I do OD.
Great.
Yeah.
Great point.
So I think one of the things, we'll come to the question that Ryan just raised in the chat. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the design of education. You've been reading about Dewey, right? And so so when we look at the turn of 17 to the 1800s, at that turn of the century, those 2 centuries, I should say, the focus was on designing an education system that was going to be accessible to all people across the United States. And it was called industrialized education. The intention, and is in some cases explicitly stated, was to create docile employees, to set up the educational process for children in ways that would put them into a place of being docile, so they would be good workers in the factory and not ask questions, and would, as some people say, check your head and heart at the door. And
which ironically is probably the opposite of what a good employee really is.
Right, right on, right, right.
Yeah.
But the intention, the design was to simulate, the rote, simple tasks
Mm-hmm.
that were incredibly boring. And what neuroscience is showing, and you may be familiar with this, but what neuroscience is showing, there's a couple of pieces I want to throw into the mix here, and I'd like to get your reactions to this. So the neuroscience is showing that there's two types of intelligence, general, and this is one school of thought, that there's crystallized intelligence and then there is fluid intelligence. The crystallized intelligence is located where the hippocampus is, which is in the center of the brain, and it goes back towards the back of the brain. And that is where rote, simple rules, simple problems, simple solutions, that's where anger, fear, shame reside. And and then when you move forward in the front part of the brain, executive function, which is where they talk about brain development, where it begins and starts developing at an accelerated fashion by about the fourth grade, or when a kid's about 8, 9 years old. And it continues to grow, as we know, through 26, 27 years old. That part of the brain deals with complex thinking, uh, collaboration, empathy, and a few other items that relate to really innovation and creative thought. So what they're beginning to show in the research is there's this thing called underutilization. That if you can create conditions to underutilize the front part of the brain and focus on the back part, you can actually stunt the growth of the human brain, so that when it gets locked in at about in the late 20s, people are stuck in a place where they are really used to and are comfortable with simple problems, simple solutions, rote work, and and I would even go as far as saying comfortable in the more uh, um, fight and flight emotions of fear, anger, and shame. So,
Or at least used to them. Yeah.
right. So then you take it, I'll add one more variable in here for us to reflect on. And that is the intelligence testing that has been going on for the last couple, 300 years, 200 years. And what they've been able to show is that the intelligence of society, and there's some debate around this or some discussion, but there's a general showing that the collective intelligence of the United States, or those that are in industrialized countries, has been increasing since they've been administering the IQ tests. It's been increasing. Now, the point to be made is that the IQ tests are designed to test crystallized intelligence, the intelligence in the hippocampus and back part of the brain, not to test fluid intelligence. So we have all of this going on, and then you talk about when you're talking about all these old management approaches. When I say old, management approaches that I would say that are 50 years or older, 50 to 100 years old, that seem to have a lot of wisdom. Even Lewin's research about engagement, transparency, listening, humility, those kinds of things. Tell me a little bit about how this plays into pulling the best of those theories and those concepts forward into where we're going now and what we're going to need for workers. And where do we fall off the rails? If that, where, how, if did Dewey subscribe to this industrialized education format?
No, he fought it. He
Oh,
he almost lost his life over his opposition to it.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I'm just asking it kind of for the audience and for you to reflect on. Could you reflect on Dewey? Who won? How did that battle? What happened to cause education to move, the industrialized education to win out over Dewey or others? And do you see it coming full circle back to the right stuff? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a lot of territory there, but so my latest book, I took Lewin's social science and applied it to racism. And in exploring that, I came to the conclusion that as soon as the Virginia colony started in the U.S., It wasn't the US at the time. We imported the class structure of England right into the colonies, and that stuck in Virginia, certainly. They came to make money and for the king, and they weren't interested in all the things that I was brought up believing about the early colonies. At least in that instance, they weren't interested in religious freedom. They were happy with the Church of England. They established it in the colonies. They weren't interested in democracy by any means. They brought Irish indentured servants with them who had no rights. They could murder them. They could beat them, rape them. They were brought against their will to serve. So that was a class structure from the beginning that's has had a big has had a grip on this country, I think, ever since. And it was when they started to bring slaves in from Africa, and the slaves and the Irish were rising up against the people in charge in Virginia and almost wiped them out in Bacon's rebellion, that they came up with the rather despicable scheme of borrowing from Sir Francis Bacon in England, divide and conquer. Let's put in a buffer class, just like you see in Oliver Twist, of the police and the people in charge of the institutions, and including the educational institutions. And let's put them in. They'll have jobs now. They'll be given a promotion, and all they got to do is keep, in this case, the blacks down. And so we started with a class structure. So what you're describing to me about the history of education, and I'm not as familiar with it as you are about the industrialized, approach or whatever. That just sounds like class structure to me. The industrial people that with the money wanted to have docile workers. Okay. Now, unfortunately, that also creates docile citizens, or citizens who are more prone to authoritarianism. And so that's what Dewey was clear about. If you want to have the fluid, the neurofluidity, if you want people to be able to think, if you want to have democracy, you have to begin in the schoolroom. It'd be good and Lewin wrote about this when he looked at Germany and the US. It would be best if it began in the family also, that kids were encouraged to think versus just obey. But you can then structure learning where kids influence what they're learning, and to a degree, but the adults still have to create the overall structure. They're the ones that have experience and have hopefully studied. How do you create experiential education that isn't just chaos, and where people are still learning basic skills, but they're also learning this to use their thinking center differently, their prefrontal cortex. Now, I would hope that, neuroplasticity, that given the right social conditions, even people brought up in an authoritarian school system, even if they were sort of stuck in that mode when they were 20 or whatever, that they could adapt and learn how to use collaborative thinking and to
One of the things is that you're hoping for, here's the challenge is that underutilized prefrontal cortex brain actually gets underdeveloped. And when it becomes underdeveloped, the plasticity is it's called PNN, and there's basically a glue that glues the neural network in place by the time you hit 27. So if you have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex due to underutilization, so an underutilization, then underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, you hit 27, 28. Then at that point, when you get out and you get put in those conditions, it is uncomfortable, even painful, to operate in a collaborative, thinking environment, and therefore the tendency is to resort back to using crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. And the question is, can you uh, recover, develop, and overcome these deficits that now have been biologically put in place?
Mhm. I believe so, but I'm not citing, and I don't know if there's been the kind of study done to say, okay, let's keep these people in an environment where they're now encouraged to think for themselves, and let's keep these people in an environment where they can't. And now that's one of the things we've lost since the days of Lewin, because he could design studies just like that, where one group was just being told what to do, and another group was being asked to think for themselves. And it was, I don't know, I think it was at least easier to set up research like that
Yeah,
back
human
in the
subjects
day.
weren't a big deal back then.
Well, they're doing more of that now. There's the what's the
Good.
Lumina? Was it called Lumina? It's an app for helping you get smarter. They actually had, I believe it's no longer around because they were making claims that it would develop the brain and and it wasn't the case, because that, they were making these wide claims. If you start practicing later, it doesn't happen. I'm working with a neuroscientist, and we're working on trying to answer this question around, what do you do with the next generation of work? What do you do when you're moving into a place where AI is going to take away a lot of the rote work, and we're going to be left with the opportunity to do more interesting collaborative work, creative work, innovative work, and those kinds of things? And how do we take a person in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and wherever you are, after your prefrontal cortex has been developed, can we get it to become more malleable and allow the brain and prefrontal cortex to grow?
I think, again, the answer is yes. So all I've got is my father's career, which started in 1953, and really got heavy into working in manufacturing organizations in the 70s and 80s and 90s and so on, and my own career. And I've just been in system after system where people are demoralized. They don't think anyone's ever listened to them. I just find that workers are hungry to be led in such a way that they're able to influence and collaborate. To me, the answer is as simple as, if people know how to lead to foster that, then people will respond, even if it takes a little warming up. But it usually
Yeah.
doesn't take much warming up. I walk into places now, and after half a day, they are already doing their own action research on how to make the work go smoother. And so I think the answer is yes, Steve.
I would hope so, right?
Most
That's my
people are
hope.
ripe for that, I think, even if they were stunted for the longest time. And I certainly, one thing we do also is we start with family of origin work in our graduate program, the Leadership Institute of Seattle. And so, in other words, people write their autobiographies, and most people that are in systems everywhere I've been, the majority had some really rough childhoods. Really rough. I mean, stuff that is hard for me to imagine. I was fortunate, and I think I'm in the minority that sort of had it easy. Mom and dad both were pretty loving, and so I lucked out. I wasn't in a war zone either. I mean, I was so. Uh, and these people, even if they were sexually abused, even if they were, certainly in the work I do in Jamaica, a number of the people who were in charge, like, their parents left the island and left them with a grandparent or an uncle who beat them every day. uh, they're in their educational system rurally. Every day, if they made a mistake, they got beaten. This is this generation of adults that have experienced this kind of trauma, and yet they're able to adjust and learn and be in T groups and start to listen to people and to start to realize that they're actually okay, and it's, you know, and they aren't the only one that went through crap. So I just got to think the answer is yes, even without having like brain scans of all the people I've worked with before and after and so on, which would be interesting. But
Yeah. Well,
I'm
Ryan,
really
tell us a
happy to
little bit
hear
more
that.
about what you were saying there in the chat.
I missed it.
Oh, oh,
You were
about the
screened out
being.
by AI.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I just had an interview with a company, and the recruiting firm, it was a contract firm for a job in a major retailer, and I was invited into a process where I recorded answers to some pre-designed questions that were not specific to the domain subject matter area, and I recorded 5 responses and played 2 interesting little cognitive testing games, and I was informed that I didn't score properly. I didn't make the score. And I thought I was pretty purple
That's
in
freaking
my answers.
humiliating.
Yeah, it was infuriating.
Did they give you any specific feedback, Ryan?
I No, and I asked for it. I said, it'd be really interesting to find out what the AI said about my responses.
Yeah.
And there's been no response to that yet. So
Well, you know,
yeah,
it's not just
You'll never
AI
see it.
that's awful, I think.
It's
And
terrible. It's a
yeah,
horrible trend to watch for.
and I almost got thrown out of. I worked 3 years in a nuclear plant, and soon after I arrived there, I took a Myers-Briggs, and then the psychologist wanted to speak to me, and it said that I tend to be
Mm.
impulsive, and there was a couple questions like, if somebody cut in front of you in a line, would you say something to them? I think I said yes.
Well,
So,
and maybe it was just on that day, in that
well,
moment, in
yeah.
that context, which is why the MBTI is,
Yeah,
Well,
it's
I
funny.
also interpret
questionable.
Go ahead.
impulsiveness as spontaneity and as a willingness to act in the moment. And,
Yeah.
you know, I
Yeah.
mean, so they're afraid I'm going to walk through the plant and start pulling, you know, levers or something, I guess.
Should
But
be a new T-shirt that says "I survived MBTI" should now be X'd over and it says "I survived artificial intelligence screening."
yeah, and it's just one
Yeah.
more thing. I think of the same of like trying to, you just can't standardize getting to know humans, for instance, and using your own judgment as a hiring person. And if you
No.
do, if you screen everybody with social style or something, and you say, well, we don't want any of these people, then you're just going to end up screwing up your organization more than you're going to help it, probably. So uh, anyway,
Yeah.
sorry you went through that,
Lisa,
Ryan.
you're a team leader. Does this ring a bell with you?
Well, for me, it's like we very much value balance in teams. So that's where in my head, what Ryan said, I just went, okay, if we need the right seats on the bus and we don't need all the same type of person, like what's going on there if we're kind of pigeonholing. If anything, I just don't know if that's, would it be helpful in what's the next phase for that person, not you're just off the list. It just to me should be an indicator of some type too. But again, I'm only been a manager for less than 2 years, so that's my initial reaction.
But
Ryan's
you
probably
would
just
want
what
the
they
people that
needed.
Gil's encouraging. You would want to have people who could tell you what they think is going on in the work and
Yeah. Oh yeah.
ask for
Absolutely.
collaboration and resources support. I can't
Yeah.
think of a manager in 2024 who's
Hmm.
really a responsible human being who wouldn't want more of what Gil
Yeah.
is
Sure, I
Absolutely.
think
telling us.
the dilemma is a lot of people, two things. One, people have authority issues. And so
Oh yeah.
a lot of people just don't want to be an authority figure. And if people report to you, you are an authority figure.
Yes.
To some degree, they are projecting onto you the people they grew up with. And and so I'm not, I forget exactly where I was going. So, but that's,
Well, I think what
Yeah.
it's almost like the authority resistance goes both ways. That those who are maybe independent and cantankerous don't wish to be controlled or dictated to in any way and disrespected. But it's interesting that you mentioned that other bit that, oh, I don't want to rise to authority because A, of some narrative from my past, or B,
Mhm.
possibly because I don't want to get, crapped on by my boss, and that's
Sure. And I
it,
might be hypercritical of the people that are in positions of authority.
exactly.
So Dave, even the thing you said earlier when you said, well, we did this study and the bosses in the US all seemed like jerks or whatever the more
Well,
technical word was.
exaggerated to a point, but yes.
Yeah. But see, to me, now the lack of connection, that's Friedman's model around, which really is what Lewin's talking about in terms of you can't to let people influence and to know how much structure is the right amount for each person and each group, you have to be in touch. And that the way that Toyota structured being in touch gave the workers some sense of who these executives and leaders really were.
Yep.
And if you're disconnected, then people are just going to imagine the worst. That's just
Always.
and so if you're disconnected, then you're an authority figure. And so it's just easy to do. And that's one reason why I love doing T group work with the whole workforce mixed together, all hourly workers, and because hourly workers get it too, that they project, that they may be misunderstanding what was actually intended by others, that they, oh,
Yep.
and if the plant manager is willing to sit in the T group and just work on themselves, that blows their minds.
Yes.
When the plant manager is realizing that they're nervous, one thing that's almost constant is that they're anxious about how they put things with the hourly people. They're afraid of being misunderstood. And I mean, certainly one thing Lewin said, it just bringing people together doesn't guarantee anything, but bringing them together with the right structure, the only way you're ever going to get people to relate to each other is you have to bring them together. You can't just keep everyone separated and expect somehow, them to have some sort of sense of community.
Right. So now you said an operative word. That's really interesting. That might be even for another conversation, but this is where the rubber meets the road. I think this is the practical side of things. You said when we bring people together, right? It's a closing comment. Let's come back and maybe talk about this.
Is this the end?
Bringing people together.
Is this an
Bringing
hour?
Yeah, it's an hour.
Okay.
Bringing people together, Gil, it's easy to say. How we bring people together, and what we do when they're together, and then what we do after they're together, those sets of tools and techniques and so forth are critical to actually having the effect that a person hopes to have. A lot of people can say, Gil, everything you said is beautiful, wonderful. I'm on board. I run out to a group, I bring them together and say, let's just talk about all the elephants, right? And it's like all of a sudden things get derailed, and Bion's work comes to life when he talks about all the dysfunctions of groups and so forth. If we were to come back next time and talked about practicality of how to do this, what would you call that next session we talk about?
I'm not sure what to call the session, but you have to have. See, it used to be almost everybody that does OD had to be in a T group and learn about their own reactions to people and to authority. Because one thing you have to do is show up. And if you're troubled by what's happening, you gotta, be not impulsive, like every time you feel anxious, you speak, but B, you gotta pay attention to what your own experience. But you have to have structure. You just have to have a structure in mind that works. So My last podcast with my dad, he talked about meetings he organized in Washington State between gay rights activists and gay and lesbian and other individuals and the rest of Washington State. And usually each meeting had like 2/3 were concerned Christians who walked in with their Bibles to the conversation. And Dad had them in groups, little groups, where there was at least 2 of the gay, lesbian individuals or activists or supporters, and the people that were concerned that this was violating, their sense of what's, morality and so on. And then he had them get to know each other with certain activities and questions. So he had structure. It wasn't just a free for all.
Yeah, and those questions are critical,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah,
How
some
you
of it's
decide.
simple, like just talk to each other about where you grew up. I mean, find some common ground, and then some of it's more complicated. But
Right. So we'll
Wow,
talk
that's
about that,
amazing.
the practicality of coming together. Ryan, I think, put a book in here for us to look at. Title. It's called "Creating Organizational Communities of Togetherness."
cool.
But let's come back together and let's talk about some practical examples, ways in which, like the simple, have that in that situation. They sat down. How was it introduced? What was the question they discussed? What happened next? Is there a pattern to how the design works such that you can mix and match different types of questions and things and have a little bit more of a game plan for how to facilitate that. I think a lot of people, I don't want to lose that because I think there's some real wisdom in the specific practical techniques. This has been fun.
Yeah.
It's time to wrap up. Dave, what's your closing comment? And Gil, I'll give you an opportunity to say the final words, but I just wanted to hear from people here. Dave, any closing comments?
Yeah, I keep thinking of the art and science of everything. And I think the science has been pretty well laid out with scripts and the rest and important tools. The art is in what Gil just said. The art is in the artist, the person who is that self-aware and comfortable with conflict. And part of the preparation, Steve, you asked about going forward, I know you do it in your programs, is what we have called sensitivity training. That's, to me, something that should come back and soon. But thank you, Gil. Congratulations to you and your dad on really doing fine work.
Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you.
Ryan, closing comment?
I can't claim that was a title of a book. That was actually just something I thought based on what you said, what the title of the next session would be.
I thought the link
Okay.
above was a link to that title. Sorry.
There you
The
go.
link was above about
Nice.
bringing communities together and kind of what the social contract is. What is it? What is the social contract we enter into when we engage in change? This could be a whole series on Lewinian development, I think. Yeah. So that's my closing comment. More, please.
Yes,
Lisa, what about you?
I think it's an application to what I'm doing. I'm thinking of the groups coming together that, there might be some conflict, but for me, it's the complacency and silence and how to get those folks like in the game that I've struggled with for all 2 years. I've been doing what I've been doing. So like, that's where, like Dr. K is saying, practical examples would be very helpful in that area, because I can usually manage a conflict, but if I can't get you to come out of the darkness, I don't know what's going to resonate. And that's kind of where I'm stuck.
Hey, Teo, any closing comments?
It is wonderful to realize that every day that I'm looking to pursue in making places, people, organizations better has a long tradition of people looking at, we have to have conversations, we have to get together and talk, we have to be intentional with putting people that will likely disagree into a conversation and try to talk it out. spent so much time in the Western world, particularly in these like binary either or. I feel that you're wrong, so I must be right, or vice versa conversations that ignore and leave out so much nuance and so much potential for growth and nourishment that I'm just really encouraged to realize again that there's a long history of this intention that goes in the more recent time to Lewin, and then the work that Gil, you and your dad have been doing, and just grateful for this conversation.
Yeah. And
Thanks. Gil, any final thoughts?
Well, sure. So just some of these comments have given me thoughts. I mean, see, the structure, the Lewin structure of training, action, and research, I think is critical. So that, like, if there's any chance of misunderstanding, and so if it's a topic that's difficult, there's a chance. I always teach the interpersonal gap, and by John Wallen. So I just think that model helps people get their own responsibility for how they react
almost done, honey.
to others. And so, so I think there is more science than art. I mean, it is an art and a science, but I don't think that most people really understand Lewin's social science, even OD professionals. And so I think there's a big gap in training in this profession. As well as much education goes on, and no disrespect intended. I mean, you're an educational program that really is bringing this to the public. I just think a lot of people don't actually read Lewin and don't understand the science of how to help people successfully navigate changes. And so I think that's one thing that that's one thing that's my mission. Get on my horse and charge the windmill. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people really do get it, but a lot of people tell me that they had never heard some of the stuff until I'm talking about it. So, and then Lisa, so part of the structure then is to also, one thing is to be transparent about your plan. I think that's really important. But when it's difficult topics, I also, besides training, I want people to have a chance to talk in pairs, have privacy, to think out loud. If for some reason people aren't talking in the group conversations, then there's a lot of different ways to do things to help create, more balanced participation. So we could spend time on that next time. Or I'd be happy just to chat with you privately, really. So, which or both. So that's it. I just think there is science, there is art, of course, but I think a lot more of it resides in the science.
Yeah, I think the
I'm with you.
intersection of the science, and the practice, of it is art. I think really, and I think that's where mastery comes in, and
Sure,
Yep.
through lots of experience and
experience
and
helps.
a lot of a lot of apprenticeships, and I think building different models for how we teach this work. Can you imagine you're trying to teach how to do OD in rows and aisles, right? Through memorized lectures and reading a book.
Mhm.
Doesn't work that way.
Really
And
doesn't.
but yeah, so it is. We don't want it to be a lost art. We just want it to. I think my passion is to bring this back as a more so. I mean, we are, but I think we have an opportunity to bring it back in ways that hasn't been really obvious over the last 30, 40 years, in my opinion, as obvious as it needs to be.
I think the
Thank
future of the
you,
human
Steve.
race
Yeah, see you.
depends on it.
Yeah.
The future of the
I
human
agree.
race, the future of democracy depends on social science helping create clarity about really what should we be doing in our institutions. How, I mean, so it's not a small thing to me.
Nope. Nope.
Right
Well, let's
on.
keep on the good work. Thanks, Gil. Have a good rest of the day. Okay.
You too. Thank you for
All right.
having me. It was a
All right.
pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for being here. Bye for now.